Hi, my name's Mitch. This will be your intro to healthy relationships, how to have and cultivate healthy relationships as a first responder. I think this is going to be a really important primer video and give you some real-time skills that you can use to improve your relationships. Also to maybe repair relationships that are currently struggling or may need some tuning up. First, it would be helpful to talk about what some of the unique challenges that are faced by first responders and their families. Many of you will be aware of these things, and so I want you to really slow it down and just pause. Things might come up. So first, it would be important, I think, to talk about what some of the unique challenges that first responders face in regards to their relationships because of the job. The biggest thing, the number one thing that I see is when guys take home baggage from the job. You might be watching this and then be thinking that to yourself right away. That taking home baggage, and by baggage I mean the emotions, the stress, the trauma, the things that you've seen and dealt with throughout the day. Having no outlet and no off switch when you get home and taking those things home to your family. I'm sure your families are aware of this too. You might be pretty good at turning that switch off. Some of you might not be, and that's okay. Another one that I've found in my work with first responders is this culture of suppressing or shoving emotions down. This one is really detrimental because the more that we hold on to emotions, we stop the stress cycle from happening, and that stuff can get stuck in our bodies and our minds and will keep us from healing and from decompressing from the day, and that compounds over time. The more and more we shove the emotions down, the more they're going to build up. And so that will inevitably impact the family. They'll be able to sense that, they'll be able to feel that. And unfortunately, that is a negative impact of the job if you're not able to release your emotions. Having no outlets or coping skills, right? That on and off switch, like I said. A lot of first responders might get home and have no skills, nothing to be able to turn that switch off. So you're in work mode 24/7, or at least a lot of the time. That's also going to have a negative impact on your families. Difficulty disconnecting. This is something, a ritual that I go through, or at least I have in my jobs in the past, where I've worn a name badge. I will take the name badge off the second I get into the car as a symbol to me that, okay, the day is done, right? It's establishing a ritual. A lot of first responders don't really have a ritual for when they get home, how to disconnect and turn off that work switch. Having a limited support system, right? Not having people, friends, and I don't mean just family. These are friends, other coworkers that you can talk to and offload the stress and the emotions and the trauma from the day. And then one of the biggest ones, I think it's kind of an elephant in the room, is the stigma. The stigma behind seeking help and processing through your emotions, right? Emotions are weak. The second you start feeling emotions on the job, you become ineffective, right? That's at least the culture that's been spread. And so this stigma might be an impairing factor or might be affecting your relationships with your family. So given these symptoms, and again, I want you to just pause if you're noticing that any of these symptoms you relate to them, that's okay, you're not alone. These things happen. There are definitely skills and things that we can do to help you improve your relationships. And it would be important to talk about why, all right? Why is it important that first responders especially focus and prioritize their relationships? One of the first things that I always think of is the work-life balance, right? We hear that term all the time, have a work-life balance. But that truly is an important aspect to having healthy relationships. Your family needs you. And if we're too caught up with the job, if we're always thinking about it, if we're working long hours and long shifts, we're not going to really have time to be there mentally, emotionally for our families. Another reason that it's really important to prioritize healthy relationships is due to trauma, right? This is a really hard truth that some of the trauma that you experience can pass down to your family. We call that secondary trauma. I think there's this culture in first responder world that, I can't talk to my family about anything. I can't tell them any of the details. And I agree with that. I don't think you should tell them the gory details. However, if you don't say anything, that's going to lead to negative impacts, both on you and especially on your family. They're gonna feel your energy. They're gonna feel that you are struggling, and yet you have no outlet for that, right? So I think it's really important that we prioritize healthy relationships in order for you to be able to emotionally process with your family, so they know that you're working on it, so they know how to help you. And social support. I think it's really important that we prioritize healthy relationships because we can't do this alone, especially a job like in law enforcement or firefighters or military. We cannot do this alone. We need support. And so whether that's friends, family, coworkers, we need to build a support system that will help us process what we see on a day-to-day basis. And so that also can help improve your relationships. So how can we improve our relationships? I've got you. I'm a therapist. This is something I do with clients and their spouses and their families all the time. I've got lots of skills. In fact, one of the big ones that I'm going to talk about next is what we call the Gottman method. For the next portion of this video, I'll be talking about the Gottman method and what it's about and what some of the skills are from it. So what is the Gottman method? Gottman, G-O-T-T-M-A-N, is a method of therapy, of couples therapy and relationships therapy developed by John and Julie Gottman. So they are a couple. John specifically has been doing research on couples and relationships since around the 70s. And he's one of the first ones in the field of psychology that's really gathered a lot of quantitative data, so numbers related data on relationships, what works and what doesn't. And so his research is really a wealth of knowledge and statistics on what works and what doesn't. And I will be using this method to help teach some skills on what might work in your relationships, on how to improve them. So before we jump into the Gottman method and some of those skills, it might be helpful to talk about what some of the red flags or warning signs that your relationships might be struggling. So some of these things are things like short tempers or having a short fuse, frequent fighting, having little to no patience with your family members, emotional distance, having a lack of real vulnerability and connection with your loved ones, lack of intimacy, a lack of connection, right? This is one thing that often is impacted because of the things we might see on the job and holding that stuff in, right? And then avoidance of each other, of emotions. This is also a sign that your relationship might be struggling. Going back to the Gottman method, one really fascinating piece of research that Gottman found, and he so helpfully compiled it into 4 concepts, is what we call the 4 horsemen. He calls them the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And before I talk about these 4 horsemen, it would even be helpful to talk about some of the interesting statistics he found. So when Gottman meets with couples, he has them do this interaction. He has them talk about an ongoing conflict or argument that, let's say, the couple's been dealing with for a little bit. And within 15 minutes, depending on this interaction, he was able to predict up to 93% accuracy whether that couple would get separated or divorced within a period of time. That's crazy, right? 93 out of the 100 couples that he studied, he was able to accurately predict whether they got separated or divorced. And the things that he was looking for, so what allowed for that predictability rate, is what we call the 4 horsemen. And so let's go over these. And again, take a deep breath. If you and your partners or family have experienced these, I promise you're not alone, but here they are. The first one is criticism. So criticism is any kind of judgment or critical words towards your partner, like something like "you're lazy," right? It's like the finger pointing. Defensiveness. Defensiveness is a big one, right? This is where we're on guard. No matter what they might be saying, and we might actually be right in our position, the idea is that us being defensive is almost a counter to criticism and just as ineffective. So being defensive all the time is one of the 4 horsemen. The next one is the biggest one that he found. This was the highest predictor for divorce or separation, and that is contempt. Contempt is essentially putting yourself on a higher pedestal in any way towards your partner or the other person. And so these things can happen in all different areas. Oftentimes I'll see them in finances, education, how to raise the kids, anything in which you feel superior to your partner or vice versa is contempt. Again, this is going to contribute, or this is the #1 contributor to divorce and separation because it creates an unequal footing. And lastly, this is everyone's favorite, I imagine, is what we call stonewalling. This is the go-to that once your emotions are too high, you shut down, right? Stonewalling is putting up a wall with your partner, right? So let's say you're in an argument and things are getting heated, your heart rate's getting up and you can't take it anymore. And so you say to yourself, I'm done. I'm shutting down, and then you shut down from the conversation. And what also is really specifically hurtful about this is usually stonewalling happens within the interaction. So you guys are still connecting or connected to each other or talking to each other, and yet there's this emotional wall. And so stonewalling is another one to look out for. One of the other big warning signs is turning away from bids. So bids, or what Gottman calls a bid, is any attempt at an emotional connection with your partner. So they're little breadcrumbs, they're little gifts that you give to your partner that invites a connection, right? These can be small things like, hey, honey, can you grab me a drink from the fridge? Or, how was your day? Let's have some alone time tonight. Let's go on a date, right? Any kind of attempt at an emotional connection. What he found is that it's highly predictive of divorce if couples are rejecting or turning away from these bids. They're really important. If you miss the bid, right, is it likely that partner is going to rebid? Probably not, right? If my partner rejected me, then I don't want to talk about it again, right? And so yeah, turning away from bids is a really important predictor of divorce and separation. In fact, he found that for the couples that ended up separated or divorced, they were only turning towards each other's bids 33% of the time, versus the couples that stayed together were turning towards each other's bids 86% of the time on average. So you can kind of see a discrepancy there. If you want to stay in your relationship, make sure you prioritize turning to your partner's bids. Next, let's talk about what some of the actionable specific tools are that you can start using with your family members. As we've been talking about, Gottman is a vast method of couples therapy, and within it, him and his wife have developed hundreds of coping skills that can help partners better communicate with each other. And so I wanted to go over some of these skills with you guys today. The first one, and this is, I would say, this is one of the most important skills, is what we call self-soothing. Self-soothing is where you actually start with yourself, right? We think, oh, I need to resolve my partner's distress first. I need to figure out the problem. But the problem is actually that we are activated. We're stressed, we're triggered, we're emotional. The first step, I would say, is what we call self-soothing. Self-soothing is any activity or skill that you can use that will calm your system down. And yes, I just said calm down, but don't ever say that, by the way, to your partner. This is where you're calming your heart rate down, right? So a breathing exercise, going for a walk, petting the dog, taking a nice bubble bath. I don't care what you do, as long as it works in reducing your heart rate. And it's really interesting, a Gottman therapist will actually, sometimes they'll put pulse oximeters on each couple's finger and track the pulse. If it goes over a certain rate, the therapist will stop the session and have the partners use the self-soothing skill to reconnect with each other. This is crucial, that any conversation you approach with your partner, you're self-soothing beforehand, all right? Reduce that heart rate. The next is what Gottman calls the friendship steps. And so these three steps are ways to build the core friendship with your partner or with whoever the person is. The first one is what we call love maps. So this is building a map of your partner or the other person's internal world, getting to know who are their friends, who are their enemies, what are their life dreams, what are their goals, things like that. Next is sharing fondness and admiration. Another word for this is building a culture of appreciation. So this is going out of your way to make sure that you are actively appreciating or thanking your partner for things, right? Hey, honey, thank you so much for doing the dishes the other day. You didn't need to do that, but thank you, right? Or any kind of an appreciation. And again, Rome wasn't built in a day. This culture of appreciation takes time, and so he calls them little deposits into the emotional bank account, right? Any of these appreciations are going to help invest in you and your partner's emotional bank account. And then we've already talked about bids. This is another one, learning how, this is number 3 of the friendship steps, learning how to turn towards, maybe even literally sometimes, bids. And so, again, getting really good at recognizing that your partner has sent a bid to you and then turning towards it instead of ignoring it or directly rejecting it. In fact, he found that it's less harmful if you directly reject one of your partner's bids versus missing the bid. And so it's really important. that in order to build friendship, you need to be responding to each other's bids. One of the next skills is one of my favorites. It's what we call the gentle startup. So this is a skill to use as an icebreaker to a hard conversation. So let's say you and your partner need to talk about how you guys have been raising the kids. Instead of using a harsh startup, which I'm sure you all have great examples of, we need to shift into a gentle startup. And so this is essentially, really it's important to make sure your tone of voice is calm. And 4 steps to the gentle startup, starting with an appreciation, right? Hey, honey, I appreciate how well we've been communicating recently. It's been awesome, right? Next, some of you are not going to like this. Feelings. Talking about your feelings, right? I feel. Turning it inwards. I feel, and then using an emotion word. You actually have to use a word that contains an emotion. So something like I feel frustrated. I feel sad. I feel overwhelmed. And then describe the situation. So again, I feel frustrated, honey, because I'm not able to cook dinner because there's dishes piling up in the sink, right? Notice how it was fairly objective. You want to describe it objectively. And then from there, you want to state your needs in positive terms. So I need us to figure out a new system. I need the dishes to be done. Find some way to state your needs and then end with a bid. So put the ball into their court, as I like to say. What do you think about this, honey? What's your perspective? Next one is what I like to call active listening 2.0. This is like an active listening skill, except we're adding to it. So instead of just listening to your partner and hearing what they're saying like an active listening skill would do, we're trying to actually also ask questions to deepen our understanding of their position. And so in order to do this skill, active listening 2.0, we need to make sure that number one, we're postponing our own agenda. And this is the most important and often the hardest part, right? Because if I'm coming into a conversation with my partner, a really important conversation, right, I'm gonna wanna argue my point. I'm gonna wanna persuade them. What he says, what Gottman says is the most important thing is actually to postpone that agenda, right? The only goal of this exercise, this skill, is trying to listen and understand your partner. And so in order to more fully understand your partner, you need to ask open-ended questions, right? Questions that don't end in a yes or no, right? What do you think about this? What is your thoughts? We need to reflect and summarize, right? So we have to actually repeat back to them what they said. Okay, honey, so what I'm hearing you say is ... And then validating or empathizing. So this is where we don't have to agree with their position, but maybe we can validate the emotions behind it, right? Like, I don't agree with you, honey, on that. However, I can understand why you believe that way. I would be angry too, right? Really communicating to them that their emotions behind it are valid. And so doing those 3, again, with postponing your agenda, will help your partner feel more heard and understood. And then one of my other favorites is what we call accepting influence, or the art of compromise. So this is where it's really going to take some skills or some practice to get good at compromising. In fact, Gottman says that compromising in a relationship or yielding your position on certain things is actually an asset to the relationship. And so accepting influence, or the art of compromise, is essentially where you're going to find the parts of your partner's position that you can agree with, and then identifying your own inflexible areas, or what we would call your core needs, and then comparing those 2 with your partner. And you guys actually need to discuss these with each other. The goal is to get to a yes between both of you, something that you can both agree on. And so again, identify your own inflexible areas or core needs. Ask them, hey, honey, help me understand your inflexible areas. Help me understand your flexible areas. What can we agree about? What are our shared goals? How can we compromise, or what can we compromise, even if it's temporary? How can I help you meet your core needs regardless, right? So these are all questions that are helpful to ask in this art of compromise. And last thing with this art of compromise is that if everything feels like a non-negotiable to you, I have hard news for you. You're probably not negotiating enough, right? So look inward. Is there something that I can actually agree with and that we can come to a shared space on? So besides coping skills, what are my options? What can I do? Well, I would say the first step is to meet with our very talented and skilled staff for a wellness check. Schedule a wellness check. It's right here on the app. Meet with someone to determine what your needs are, especially in a relationship. I promise you, working with an individual therapist actually can help you work on your relationship as well. So that would be the first step. However, there's some other things as well. I would say get a Gottman therapist. If you feel like you and your partner could use some therapy, some help, find a Gottman therapist. It's on his website, Gottman.com. You can find a Gottman therapist and you guys can meet. That would be the best way to learn the Gottman method. However, we have also got some other resources that we have listed here. Go ahead and pause to read. Hopefully some of this was helpful. Take a moment now to just kind of take inventory of how you're feeling, note any things that could use some improvement, and then see if you can take some action on it. I really encourage that. You can do this. You and your partner, your family deserve it.